In this series of videos, we're going to be learning about the homeostatic regulation of the female reproductive system. But before we go into detail, we need to talk about the two primary organs of the female reproductive system and what exactly they do. The first of which being the ovary, and the second of which being the uterus. Now, we start with the ovaries because this is where the female monthly reproductive cycle begins, and it all begins with these structures here, which are what we call follicles. Now, if we see within the structure of an ovary, we can see that on day 0, that being the beginning of the female reproductive cycle, hormone stimulation from one of the pituitary hormones is going to cause a number of immature follicles to be released from the walls of the ovary, and eventually one of these follicles, which is called the primary follicle, is going to grow into the mature form that contains the egg that will eventually be released from the ovary and be allowed to be fertilized in the event where sperm are able to find this egg. Now, if we zoom in and take a closer look at a follicle, we can see that a follicle is not actually a single cell. The primary cell of the follicle is what we call the oocyte, and if you're familiar with this prefix here, we can kind of see that it looks similar to the French œuf, meaning egg. This prefix here indicates that it has something to do with the egg, because the oocyte is simply the immature ovum, and ovum we know is the scientific word for the female egg. Now, we say that the oocyte is immature because it's not actually big enough and not ready to be fertilized in order to produce a successful fetus. It needs help from all of the cells that surround it, which are what we call granulosa. Now, granulosa, if we look at the beginning of this word, we can see the word granule, which is a word that's used to describe small particles like grains of sand. And these were given this name because if we look at the follicle under a microscope, we can see that granulosa look like individual grains of sand, meaning they are too small to see that they are actually individual cells. Now, the job of the granulosa is to supply the growing oocyte with the nutrients that it needs to grow, and also with the primary female sex hormone, which is what we call estrogen. And that estrogen produced by the granulosa migrates to the oocyte and triggers the chemical processes inside that will allow the ovum to mature up to the point where it is ready to be released from the ovaries. And this is what we call the ovarian cycle, meaning the cycle that takes place within the ovary. And during this process, our goal is to help the immature oocytes to mature until the point where it is ready to be released from the ovary and ready to make its way on the journey to find a sperm, which will eventually fertilize it. And this process here, we're not actually looking at a single ovary like this. We're actually looking at the sequential progression from day 0, the beginning of the female reproductive cycle, up to about day 14, which is around the midpoint of the female reproductive cycle. And after about 14 to 15 days, again, this number depends on the individual female cycle, the oocyte has fully matured and is now a fully functional egg that is ready to be released from the ovary. And we can see here that it looks like the wall of the ovary is actually breaking, but the truth is actually far more exciting than that. The fully grown follicle here fuses to the wall of the ovary and basically forcibly ejects the mature ovum out, kind of like a miniature volcano eruption, and this process is what we call ovulation. Now, the reason why ovulation is necessary is because the goal location, the tubes that connect the ovary to the uterus, which are what we call the oviducts, are not actually physically connected to the ovary, meaning that the ovum must actually cross this gulf and be caught by the oviduct in order to transfer it towards the uterus. And that is the first half of what we call the ovarian cycle, and generally includes most of the functions as far as the ovaries go, because if the ovum is fertilized by a sperm inside of the oviducts, eventually it is going to make it to the second primary sex organ of the female reproductive system, that being the uterus. Now, if we look at the uterus, we can see that there are actually two different types of tissues. There's the dark red tissue on the inside, which is what we call the endometrium. And we know that this is the type of tissue that is found on the more inside layer of the uterus because, of course, of the prefix endo. Now, the endometrium has a number of functions. We can see in this diagram here that it is a much darker red color, which probably indicates that it has a much higher amount of blood flow in it, because the endometrium is largely composed of blood vessels, specifically capillaries, and their job is to provide the growing baby, the fetus inside of this, with nutrients and with oxygen gas in order for the fetus to be able to grow and breathe and sustain itself until it is ready to be born. But of course, if the fertilized ovum doesn't actually make it into the uterus, none of this function of feeding the fetus is going to be important. Therefore, the other thing that is produced by the endometrium is a sticky layer of mucus that forms on the walls of the endometrium like this. And this mucus is eventually going to be used for the process of implantation. Implantation is simply when the fertilized egg, which is what we call a zygote, sticks into the layer of mucus and implants itself into the side of this structure, again, in order to be close to the blood vessels, so that the growing mass of cells, which will eventually become a fetus, is supplied with enough nutrients and oxygen to grow. Now, eventually, when this fetus gets bigger, let's just draw the fetus at the proper size where the fetus is ready to be born. Now, at this point, we need to rely on the second or outermost layer of tissue in the uterus, which is what we call myometrium. And we can recognize from the prefix myo, which you can see in other types of tissue like myocardium, heart muscle. Myo indicates that this is muscular tissue. Now, it's very important that the uterus have strong muscles, because eventually we are going to need to get the fetus out of the uterus. And as with all muscles, myometrium basically only has two regular functions. Number one, it needs to be able to relax in order to expand itself as the fetus grows bigger and bigger and bigger. But eventually, after 9 months has passed, the myometrium needs to contract in order to squeeze and push the baby out at the time when birth is ready to be possible. Now that we've looked over the basic functions of the two major organs of the female reproductive system, the ovaries and the uterus, in the next video, we're going to go into more detail about the actual cycles that happen during the entire process of getting the female reproductive system ready for birth.